Generally, in my experience with your conferences, people are familiar with GAO, but I'll just give you a brief background. GAO does work at the request of Congress. We are an independent agency, and we respond to their request by designing our work and developing the scope and methodology, and then providing them with a description of what we are going to do. Our work is not directed by Congress, but it is at their request. So throughout the work, the course of the engagement, we consult and we make sure that they are in agreement with what we are doing. We usually try to do our work to make our work bipartisan for both the majority and the minority. And the work that I'm going to speak about today that is the case for these reports that I'm going to speak about. The work is under the authority of the Controller General, who serves a term of 15 years and is appointed by the President and confirmed by Congress. Jean Dodaro is our current Controller General and has been in that position for a while. And that's a brief introduction, and I'll get started with the presentation. I work in our physical infrastructure group, which oversees a number of areas. And the area that I generally work in is real property and now doing some personal property work. We also handle issues such as transportation, fleet, aviation, and a number of other physical infrastructure related issues. I'm going to talk about 3 projects that make up part of our body of work on infrastructure. One is a report that was issued about 2 years ago, where we established an asset management framework and what we're calling key characteristics of an asset management framework. This work is largely based on ISO 55000. So when I speak about this framework, I am speaking largely about ISO 55000. But you'll hear that my presentation is going to be focused on this framework that we developed. In order to do this framework, I'll explain what we did in a couple of slides. The next report I'm going to speak about is one that was issued in September, just a few weeks ago, about the Food and Drug Administration's property management. And that I'm going to speak on that one mostly about personal property. And the next one is an ongoing engagement, and I don't have results to report for you, but I can speak about what we're doing in this engagement. And this one I'm very interested in because it's about what we're calling natural disaster resilience, or resilience to climate change, climate-related disasters in the context of asset management. And some of you likely are doing work on this as well. This is our asset management framework, which some of you have seen before. This is the framework that we developed in our report GAO 1957, and it is largely based on ISO 55000. However, we also looked at other leading practices, and we looked at the IIMM, and we interviewed experts and a couple of other sources. But in order to develop this graphic, I would say it was mostly ISO 55000 that fed into it. But we broke it up looking at 4 phases. As you can see, organizational strategic planning is in the top. What we're calling asset management strategy and planning, which includes several elements of the asset management process: decision-making, risk management, data and information, and then the life cycle process that many of you are familiar with: acquiring, operating, and maintaining and disposing of assets. And then a review process, which should feedback or inform your planning. So we see it as all related, which it should be. And that's what this graphic is intended to illustrate. And this is the framework that we've been using. This is the framework that we use to inform our work on the two engagements that I am going to talk about. It's also being used on a couple of other engagements. We have an ongoing engagement looking at the Department of Veterans Affairs and their management of their physical property, their capital assets. That work is also underway. I'm not going to speak about that today because I think there's not quite enough time for that. The next slide is the characteristics that line up with the asset management framework that I just showed you. And we developed, we call them the 6 key characteristics. This is just a high-level view of these characteristics. And these also were developed through an extensive set of interviews with experts who had a lot of experience. Some of you might be attending. It's different when you do these things virtually. You can't see who's in the audience, but some of you might be listening. And this was a long process that we went through of interviewing experts, reviewing literature on asset management, also incorporating the ISO 55000 standard. We came up with these characteristics that we thought all of them were necessary. And in the presentation that you just gave, you mentioned several of these as well, such as leadership support and the portfolio's value. I don't think these should be a surprise to anyone. And we did not see these as sequential. We did not see these as, you know, one has to come before the other. We thought all of these were equally important. So don't take the list to be an intention that one should come first. I wonder how I can fix that.
You can drag and move it around, but it has a propensity to always be in the way.
Okay.
Wherever you drag it, yes.
Okay. Let me try. Oh, I see. Okay. All right. I can move it down. Okay. Basically, we looked at 3 of the FDA's regulatory centers, which is the majority of the centers' work. The 3 centers are CBER, which is the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, CDER, which is the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and CDER-H, which is the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. Mostly these centers work on human medical product safety, security, and effectiveness. That means vaccines, blood products, drugs, and medical devices. And then the focus was mostly on personal property. I'm not going to talk much about real property because the property that they use is owned by GSA. They have a lease with GSA for their facilities, the ones that we looked at. The reason for doing this work is that Congress included a provision in statute for GAO to examine FDA's expenses at these 3 centers. And the reason for that is there's going to be an authorization for a reauthorization taking effect in 2023. And there will be more restrictions on how FDA can use the user fees that it gets from industry. So when a pharmaceutical company applies to FDA for approval of a drug, just for example, they pay a fee to FDA to review their application. And similar to a device or a manufacturing company, they pay a fee to FDA. Those fees will be, well, the process is already starting for negotiation, but the way in which those fees can be used is going to be included in the reauthorization that takes effect as of fiscal year 2023. So that's just in 2 years. And the reason, 2 or 3 years. The reason why that's important is that the user fees fund a lot of the personal property. We looked at the budgets from 2012 to 2019, and we saw that 56% of the funding was used for, 56% of the funding, or the way the funding was spent, was user fees. So with more restrictions on the user fees, there could be an impact on how FDA can fulfill its mission. So I'm going to skip ahead. Basically, this bottom of this slide tells you a little bit about our methodology, but I'm going to go to the next slide. What we found when we looked at this work is we were going to apply our 6 key characteristics, and as we did the work, we found that 2 of the 6 were most relevant. So what I'm trying to focus on here is that you don't necessarily have to apply all 6 characteristics if they're not applicable. What we found was that FDA was not, in this case, was not advanced in terms of asset management for personal property. So we found that they were not using quality data, which is one of the characteristics, or establishing formal plans and policies. In that seemed to be the way that made most sense for focusing our work. Without that, they really were not able to meet the requirements of their mission, in order to do the reporting that would be necessary to show how their user fees were the use of user fees were fulfilling their mission, and in order for us to provide the information that we needed to provide to Congress. So this is an example of the lab equipment. This is personal property. If you look to the right and the left, these are refrigeration units where they would keep things like samples, blood samples, and other types of samples for testing. That's just an example of one of the things we saw. We were able to look in the labs. Couldn't enter all of the labs because of the biosafety levels. These are some examples of what we found. For their personal property assets include scientific and laboratory equipment, which could be a number of things that are mission related. Also, information technology is what allows the scientists to do their jobs. This is not only computers, but the technology that they use for testing, some of the advanced technology that they use in order to do their basic work. And then some less specialized things like office furniture that they use in the labs, and also just that they use for their offices. There's been a large increase in the number of staff at FDA because, as you may know, there are many more drugs out on the market. Pharmaceutical companies have had a lot of growth over the last many years, and therefore FDA has hired a lot of staff. And so they've needed a lot more of this equipment and also more space. We found that for all of the 3 phases of the asset that I showed in the framework in the beginning, basically asset management and strategy, asset lifecycle delivery, and review. I'm using slightly different words in this slide, but that's what I'm talking about. For all of these phases, we did not see that they had good quality information or formal plans and processes. So there are a few examples here. There's a lot more in our report. For example, they did not have a good process. They had very informal processes for collecting information and identifying personal property needs. We found that the 3 centers did not do things the same way. And in some cases, the centers share information or share resources. So it's important that they have the same way of doing things. For example, CBER and CEDAR both do evaluation and research. One is on drugs and the other is on biologics, but they're doing similar work. And they were collecting information in different ways. Also, they didn't have a consistent way of setting priorities. They didn't seem to link their priorities in terms of their needs to FDA's mission. So they had ways of saying what they needed. Again, these were very informal. For example, a lab manager would put in a request for property, say a certain type of diagnostic tool, but they would not have a real method for doing that. And they did not have a good database for showing what they already had, for documenting what the condition of equipment was. That gets into operations and maintenance, which is the third bullet. They just didn't have a good way of tracking the condition of equipment or assessing on a regular basis what the condition was. And in some cases, a couple of the centers share labs, which is a good thing because they're making better use of resources, but they're not sharing information on operating and maintaining the labs. And then a final point in terms of review or evaluation, which is the last level in our framework. They didn't use information to set goals or to make decisions, to review or to document progress toward goals. So much of this is about documentation and also information collecting and managing information. Those are just some highlights. We made recommendations, which I'm sure you can guess, that they should establish plans and policies for doing this. And we broke it down in terms of planning, which we put in the context of being able to link their decisions to their goals, operations and maintenance in terms of tracking condition and maintenance and repair costs, and then review or evaluation in terms of measuring and documenting performance. FDA did concur with our recommendations. It would have been hard for them not to agree. And they say that they're going to do this. I think part of the reason for them not doing this, not to give them an excuse, but they have been over the last several years really inundated with applications. As I said, the pharmaceutical and device industries have grown very quickly. And as many of us know, I think when you have a lot of growth, or it's not exactly a crisis, but they're really overwhelmed. Sometimes planning and management are not focused on as much as they should be. But our argument in terms of asset management is that that's exactly the time when you need to consider these things. They become even more important because if you don't know what you have, you don't know what you need. And the whole concept behind asset management is that you have to maximize the return on your investment or maximize your portfolio's value, even for personal property. So I'm going to quickly turn to our ongoing work, which is, as I said, I can't give you results from this, but this is looking at natural disaster resilience. GAO issued a product, 2100 SP, which I think Mike sent out recently in an ALN newsletter. And this is a conceptual framework for looking at natural disaster resilience. GAO has defined, I'm giving you the definition here, but basically GAO has defined natural disaster resilience as, it's a long definition, but preparing for anticipated hazards, adapting to changing conditions, and withstanding and recovering rapidly from disruptions caused by natural disasters. So that is the definition that we are using, since GAO already had one. And what we're doing here, which I find interesting, is using the concepts from this framework and also our key characteristics from our asset management framework to see how well agencies are integrating resilience into asset management, how well, or if at all, they are integrating resilience into asset management. So just one example, one of the concepts in the disaster resilience framework is that you need to prioritize resilience goals that reflect the most pressing challenges. And that is directly related to one of our key characteristics in the framework, that is maximizing an asset portfolio's value. So that's what we are doing in this work. We are looking at the relationship between the concepts in the natural disaster framework or disaster resilience framework and our key characteristics, and we're going to see whether agencies have actually taken into account resilience in terms of asset management. And this work is about halfway done, so we expect to issue it in April, hopefully, if things go well. But this is of interest, as many of you know. There's a lot of focus on climate change, and this year with the wildfires and a record number of hurricanes and other things around the world, I'm looking forward to this report. I think it will be timely, and I think it will be very interesting. Just I'm not going to go through this now, but these are some details. Are you going to be posting the slides or sending the slides?
Yes, posting
Okay,
it.
so this gives you the details of the 6 key characteristics for anyone who wants to look at them later, and this gives you the reference for our report.